Hello everyone, I'm Riya Gandhi and welcome back to my channel. When we talk about modernism and postmodernism, these are the literary buzzwords that are often thrown around in lectures, conferences, seminars, textbooks and exam papers. But the more we try to read about them, the more we try to understand them, the more confusing and tangled it all seems. With both these movements happening around in the major part of 20th century, you might be wondering that what is the difference between modernist and postmodernist anyway? Well, that's exactly what we are untangling today. Not with the boring definitions, but with something that is really interesting. We are going to uncover the key differences between these two movements, understand their historical context, the major authors, the major literary figures, and some of the most important theories that were produced during this point of time. So if you are preparing for your UGC NET English exam, or you're just trying to understand these theories as a literature student, then this video is just for you. So stay tuned till the end of this video and don't forget to make notes. So, when we talk about modernism and postmodernism, these are the two literary movements that occurred in the 20th century. And they emerged as a response to the first two world wars. Even though they emerged in the 20th century, their beliefs, their values, and the kind of literature that they produced is basically worlds apart. And that's what we need to understand today. But to understand that, we need to first create a mood board. So as you can see over here on your screen, there are two mood boards. On the extreme left, the mood board is talking about this empty chair and this lone traveler, and also a painting of this very tired and fatigued man on which it is written introspection. At the same time, you also see an abstract painting, right? You see a bed and you see this painting which is very orderly, which is very much organized, right? So what are the common buzzwords, or what are the common words that strike in your mind when you look at this particular mood board on the extreme left? What I think is maybe loneliness, right? Isolation, but there is also some order there, right? And then shift your focus to the extreme right? Let's talk about this mood board on the extreme right. What do you see over here? You see Marilyn Monroe. You see some very pop culture images, right? Like comic books or designs that showcase comic books. Then there is this picture of like buildings and people that are like all topsy-turvy, and it really does not make any sense, right? It feels very absurd. Talking about absurd, you have a quote and a mention of Samuel Beckett, one of the most important playwrights of the theatre of absurd, right? And besides that, there is a picture of a man who's wearing a hat, but his face is not shown. Instead, it is covered by some fruit or something. Any of this does not make any sense. Yet, there is that brightness related to it, that playfulness which is present in the second picture and which is absent in the first picture, right? So remember this very important point, guys, especially in the later video when we talk about the difference between modernism and postmodernism. Right, having said that, now let's move on with the rest of the video talking about the historical context in which both the literary movements, that is modernism and postmodernism, came into being. So let's first start talking about modernism. When we talk about modernism, it is a movement that emerged in the late 19th and the early 20th century in response to the First World War. So understand that when I talk about modernism, it is not just a literary movement. It is also an artistic, a cultural, and even an architectural movement that sort of like encapsulated everything, right? So what happened during that point of time was that people were extremely shocked. They were extremely disoriented from their own realities. They were disillusioned. They stopped believing in the ideals of humanity. They stopped believing in God. They had no faith. And so many things and so many emotions were sort of breeding during that point of time. So the predominant ideas that you see during that point of time were alienation, fragmentation in terms of the conscious mind, right? Understanding that everybody is different, everybody is separate, right? Talking about chaos, right? That everything was chaotic. People did not know themselves enough. There was a complete rejection of traditional values and techniques. To deal with something as huge as World War, people did not believe in the traditional ideas and values. They wanted something else. They completely rejected all of those things. And so what did they do instead? They experimented, right? They tried new and innovative techniques in literature, in art, and that's what you see happening during this point of time. You see different art movements like expressionism, you see surrealism, you see vorticism, right? All of these art movements started occurring during this point of time because writers, painters, thinkers, they wanted to experiment. And so instead of focusing on what was happening around them, right, the focus was the inner world, right, the mental landscape of these people, what they were feeling, what their emotions were. So the buzzword over here becomes subjectivity, right? And so that is also reflected in literature. What you see is non-linear storytelling. Take any novel by Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, or for that matter, any work of T.S. Eliot, you will find that there is blurring of the time frames. You'll find that past and present are intermingled together. You see the thoughts and dialogues of the characters intermingled together. And so this is why you see the emergence of stream of consciousness technique, right? So talking about how the thoughts, they are flowing in the form of a river, they are flowing in the form of stream, and you cannot stop that. So the shock of wars and the human destruction sort of like pushed the people during the modern age into themselves, right? Talking about their minds, their thoughts, their feelings. But despite having all those emotions and feelings of alienation, fragmentation, isolation, right there in the middle of this mood board, you have a very organized painting, a very orderly painting. Why do you think is that the case? Because we just talked about fragmentation and experimentation, right? The idea behind this painting is that even though the world around the people during the modern age was breaking down, was completely chaotic, and they were pushed into themselves, people, especially the writers, thinkers, painters alike, they were still trying to find some order in the chaos. They were still trying to find some meaning behind the chaos. They were still trying to find something. They knew that there is no meaning, and they believed that there is no order in the chaos, but they still tried to find that order. And that's what is reflected in modernism. And that is the point that differentiates it from postmodernism. So when I'm talking about postmodernism, postmodernism is a literary movement that emerged after the Second World War. So you can imagine in the latter part of the 20th century. So what was the prevalent mood during that point of time? Now, during that point of time, people were not shocked per se with the Second World War, because they knew that the First World War had happened. Now there is a Second World War. So instead of shock, the prevalent mood during that point of time was basically a very numb feeling. And add to that, you have this rise of capitalism, rise of consumerism, which basically numbed out that feeling of pain, that feeling of disillusionment amongst the citizens or the people during that point of time. Right? And also remember that with the rise of capitalism and with the rise of consumerism, pop culture became a very, very important phenomenon during that point of time. Right? That's why in the Moodboard you had Marilyn Monroe, right? Because she became that pop cultural icon during that point of time. So as a result of this rise of capitalism and consumerism, postmodernists weren't really interested in finding out that one true meaning of life as modernists were. They realized that life is meaningless anyways, so why not embrace this chaos? Why not embrace this kind of fragmentation, right? So how is that applicable in literature and art? For instance, when you talk about postmodernist art, instead of putting much time, efforts, and thought into how to express human emotions and human feelings on a canvas, what would a postmodernist painter do? They would basically create a collage of newspaper clippings and that's it, and present it as a work of art. For a postmodernist painter, a pen can also be a piece of art based on their perspective, right? In terms of literature, instead of creating something new, perhaps they would just do a remake. That's what we see happening over here in music and in so many other cultural artifacts and cultural objects, right? We see the remakes of it, which is called as pastiche. Pastiche is a very, very important element of postmodernism, guys. So please remember this word. It's basically a remake of sorts. So you don't put extra thought and extra time and efforts in it. You just do a remake of it. At the same time, how is it reflected in literature? In literature, you can talk about self-reflexivity or metafiction. So when I'm talking about metafiction is fiction that consciously draws attention to itself as a work of fiction. What does that mean? The basic example is breaking the fourth wall. There are so many movies, so many dramas in which the characters, they consciously break the fourth wall, wherein they are talking directly to the camera, that is indirectly to us, or dramas in which the characters on stage, they are talking to the audience members. By breaking the fourth wall, they are consciously drawing attention to itself as a work of fiction, reminding the readers that whatever they are reading, whatever they are watching is not real, but a constructed narrative, right? It destabilizes the traditional notion of literature as a mirror of reality and makes the readers aware of the illusion. Now, to make these key differences between modernism and postmodernism more clear to you, here are a set of examples, literary examples that will help you understand it in a better manner. So when we talk about Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, it is a purely modernist text because it talks about one day in the life of Clarissa Dalloway. We enter her head, we shift perspectives, we talk about her thoughts, we understand her thoughts, her feelings. We also realize that she is extremely lonely even as she's throwing a party, right? The idea is, in this entire novel, there is this one grand narrative of Clarissa Dalloway. On the other hand, you have Milan Kundera's The Book of Laughter and Forgetting. When we talk about The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, it is talking about 7 mini narratives. Instead of talking about one main narrative as we had in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, here you have 7 mini narratives that are not interlinked together per se, right? Which brings me again to one of the most important points of postmodernism, and that is the rejection of grand narratives. They do not want to focus on one main story. The author is not trying to make sense, right? The language, the narrative seems pretty absurd. We don't understand what is happening, nor is the author trying to provide us with an explanation. And nor we as readers are trying to find out that one single meaning or interpretation out of it. There are so many gaps in the text, but these gaps are intentionally left by the author that we have to fill based our own subjective notions. Another important postmodernist element that you see in this particular work is intertextuality. Intertextuality is one of the most important postmodernist elements, which basically means references to other literary works, right? So in this particular novel, you see literary references to Kafka, Nietzsche, and all of those other philosophers, right? Again, making this a very postmodernist work. Now, having said that, I hope you're getting somewhere in understanding the differences between modernism and postmodernism as literary movements and how they are applicable in literature. Now, there is one more point that I would like to add to this, that in tandem with the prevalent thought processes and beliefs that were emerging during modernism and postmodernism, you also see the emergence of critical theories and approaches. For example, as you can see over here on your screen, the prevalent critical approaches during modernism were Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory, Karl Marx's communist theory, and structuralism. All of these, if you look at it one by one, they sort of talk about that one objective meaning, or they take up only one perspective. Next, when we talk about postmodernism, think about the prevalent thought processes, ideas, values, beliefs that were present during this point of time. Remember, we talked about how the postmodernists wanted to embrace chaos, and they enjoyed the fact, in fact, they celebrated the fact that life is meaningless. And so that is also seen in their critical approaches, starting with Derrida's deconstruction theory, talking about pluralities of meaning. Next, talking about Michel Foucault's idea of power and knowledge, right? And according to Foucault, knowledge is basically created and reinforced and circulated by people in power through certain discursive practices, right? And then finally talking about post-structuralism, how it emerged in reaction to, in opposition to structuralism, and how they did not believe that meaning is created through one particular structure or that meaning is objective. So you see that even the critical theories or the critical approaches that were emerging during this point of time, they were contributing to the prevalent thought processes, values, ideas, beliefs, be it of modernist period or postmodernist period. Now, this was about the main theorists and their key theoretical contributions related to modernism or postmodernism. Let's talk about some of the key authors, right? So when it comes to modernism, you already know that the major authors during this point of time were Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, D.H. Lawrence. In fact, the period from 1920s to 1930s is known as the period of high modernism because it was associated with writers like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. Now, as far as postmodernist authors are concerned, you have Thomas Pynchon, Italo Calvino, Kurt Vonnegut, Joseph Heller, Salman Rushdie, Margaret Atwood. These are very, very important postmodernist authors because they are frequently asked in UGC NET English exam as well. And if you want more such simplified explanations, you know where to look in the description box below. That's it for today's video, folks. If you found this video on the breakdown of the differences between modernism and postmodernism informative and helpful, please like, share and subscribe to my channel for more such insights on literature and especially for UGC NET English exam. Thank you so much for watching till the end. I'll see you in the next one.